The World Bank predicts that by 2050, we're going to have 143 million climate refugees. And there are credible reports that say that that number is being too low. It could be much higher than that. So we really need to get a grip on this. If we can't even deal with a few thousand refugees coming in from the Bahamas, how are we going to deal with hundreds of millions in the future? And really, it's the the island nation states and those that are below sea level and the lower latitudes. These are the places that are going to be impacted are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and that's where we're going to see the majority of this migration coming from.
Yeah, those islands, you talk about the areas below sea level, feeling it now, but there are places all over the world that are going to obviously experience it very soon. Are governments doing enough, like, for example, banning new construction on barrier islands?
Well, so that's the thing. We can look at engineering, and we do need to fortify buildings, and we need to make sure that all of the codes are being put into place, given what we know about sea level rise, given what we know about permafrost thawing. But is that really enough, given the intensity of what we know is coming? These are predictable trends. There's an example of a village in Utah, Alaska, that because of coastal erosion is having to move inland just 9 miles. And it's costing this move, this relocation of just 350 people, $100 million. So we know that it's expensive to actually move entire communities, but ultimately that is going to be cheaper than if we keep having to rebuild, fortify, and then realize that that wasn't enough.
What else is being done to help this migration to areas that are being affected by tidal surges, subsidence?
So there is a lot of initiatives in place from local to regional to global levels. What needs to be done to really ensure that we are working as a community, a global community, because ultimately if you don't look at the big picture, no amount of local effort is really going to be able to solve what is a cross-border issue. The migrations right now are still mostly within states and within countries, but ultimately when you have some of these places that are going to have the severity of what we're anticipating, you're talking about mass migrations of people across borders, and that's when you really need to take a view that is more global.
And that leads into all the work done in the Paris Accord, which virtually every nation has embraced, except famously the United States,
right,
and a president who calls it climate change a hoax. What is the concern when you have someone like U.S. President Donald Trump talking about climate change being a hoax if everybody doesn't really push in to enforce the measures that were spelled out?
And it's so devastating that that's what's happening, especially when the U.S. should be the leader in really recognizing that this is a real threat, not just at a global security level, but it is a national security threat. This is climate change that's resulting in migrations of people and our borders, which is why the Bahamian refugees have been dealing with difficulties coming and staying in the U.S. because the anticipation that this is going to increase and it's just going to be unmanageable. The real reason also that refugees aren't getting the treatment that they deserve is because the UN hasn't declared them as refugees. They're referring to them as environmental migrants. So they don't have the same legal pathways in new countries that real refugees following some sort of political strife would have. So from a global perspective, we need to change. We need to first recognize that these are refugees. That needs to happen. And then looking at it from a global security perspective and then at a nation state level, how are we going to then protect within our borders, but then also recognizing that we share borders and we do live on a shared planet?
You know, you talked about that area in Alaska. There's also an area in southern Louisiana called Ile de Saint-Jean, and we went down and did a story there where I'd say maybe 35 to 50 Native Americans were basically moved off that island, and now they're safe, they're dry, but they lost their way of life. They used to fish, shrimp, and crab, and it's very difficult for them to adapt to this new life. So we're going to face so many hurdles.
And we need to get ahead of it because exactly, we know this. So if we are proactive and we think about how to manage retreat, not just move people inland, not just fortify buildings, but really the whole picture, like you said, what does this mean for cultural practices? What does this mean for generations of people who have devoted and secured their communities and their livelihoods along the coast? People love living on the coast. There's a pull to the water, and that is actually a huge challenge, a huge barrier to overcome when you're thinking about convincing people, because there's hundreds of millions that want to live along the coastline, that prefer to live along the coast, and now we're telling them, no, you can't do that. So we need to anticipate some of those challenges and look at the whole picture and give people alternatives. It's not so bad living by a lake.
Yeah.